technology, or especially ICT in healthcare, there's a significant reduction in cost. Counter to that is also the point that technology raises the cost of healthcare, like extra MRI scans or extra PET scans or so on and so forth. But I think ICT is slightly different than excessive MRI scans, right? So here's an example of a woman who's completely empowered, who's changed her life and her lifestyle. Instead of carrying like a 15-pound Dynavox machine, she's got like a 15-ounce or whatever, 10-ounce iPhone. Is it AT&T's, by the way? Yeah, I forgot. Right? So here's another example of a farmer. Now I can tell, I think maybe I'm one of the 3 people out here who are from India. But if you were born in India, the sense of hierarchy was about as strong as one could get. And I'm not blaming the British for it. They had nothing to do with it. It existed before the British were there. They just exploited it. So here's a farmer now who, between the time a grain is harvested to the time it reaches your table, there is a 10x price differential between the harvesting and the table. And all of this money is made by the traditional landowners in India, who are the rich people. They're called zamindars, as in landowners, right? And these are the rich people who basically have these little farmers work for them, and they get nothing out of it. Because of cell phones, so India does not have, if you've ever been to India, you'll realize, actually, now it's a lot better, but 15 years ago, India does not have a landline infrastructure which is as developed as this country. Not at all. I mean, nothing comparable, right? But here's a farmer, because of this cell phone, can now deal directly on the spot market and put his grain, his harvest on the spot market at prevailing prices, and a lot more empowered, make a lot more money, get rid of all the non-value added middle layer components, right? So one of the things that ICT is doing, and I'll talk a little bit about it later, is getting rid of non-value added components that existed in the past because supposedly they were adding value, creating markets, connections, logistics, supply chain, and so on and so forth. But now, because of the ICT technologies, all of these layers have gone, and the real benefiters of these technologies are the people who create them and the people who use them, and the users at the other end. So all of these middlemen have to find new jobs. Let me give you another example. We talk about e-governance, e-politics, e-governments, and so on and so forth. This is a recent example from Iran. Not that this was a spectacular success, but the success here was that a bunch of people, a few million of them, were able to talk or fight against the government. In the end, they didn't win, but that's not the point. The point is they were able to rally with each other, rally together, and talk and discuss the issue of fairness in elections. And it put a very strong spotlight on Iran, which actually would have other consequences as time goes on, both economic and political consequences, right? But the point I'm trying to make, and I think I'm now beating a dead horse out here, is that ICT is a tool of great empowerment. And it empowers not just the Ciscos and the Microsofts of this world, people who have become very rich doing this, but it empowers this individual who basically was nobody 10 years ago and now suddenly has a voice, suddenly has an opinion, suddenly can be heard, and a lot of good things happen, a lot of transformations happen because of this. Now, let's look at investments in ICT. So if you look at ICT in the world, right, if you look at the GDPs of the world, various companies, various countries like EU and the US, it is clear that there is, actually this is a better slide out here, that if you look at, for example, the US GDP over the last decade or so, between 95 and 2004, the average growth rate is 3.5%. And about 0.8 of this 3.5% is directly attributable to ICT. So what does that mean? You can say, okay, what does that mean? Does that mean ICT is 0.8% of our GDP? No. If you look at our growth rate, 0.8% is attributable to ICT in the sense that a lot of inefficiencies in the system were gotten rid of, and that money was reinvested in technologies, mainly ICT, that led to large companies, that led to more jobs, and so on and so forth. So 0.8, which is about 25% of the GDP, 0.8 of about 20% of the GDP, is basically because of ICT. So why am I making this case? I think all of you know this. The reason I'm making this case is because most countries don't quite invest as heavily in ICT. If you look at the history of ICT, it did not happen by accident one fine morning. The world didn't get up and say, oh yeah, here's the World Wide Web, let's all use it. If you look at the history, it's a post-World War II history, and you can only thank, honest to God, one country, which is the United States of America. Post-World War II, the United States did something very interesting. Okay, I'll get to that in a second, but let me just explain this ICT. Now that I've put the thought in your mind, I think it's an interesting component to think about, right? So the U.S. over many, many years has invested significantly in ICT, mainly DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, NIST, National Science Foundation, and the Internet, which was one of the main components on the World Wide Web, which basically came from Switzerland, some people working out there. But our investment in this area has been billions and billions of dollars over the past 20 years. Now, the good thing is we had the foresight, we invested in this area, but we didn't invest thinking that the world is going to become flat. Probably if some of the government people knew this is what was going to happen, they probably would not have invested in this. We invested in this because we thought it was the right thing to do. Part of it was pure scientific discovery. The other part was creating efficiencies in the system. Another part was improving our defenses, as in the missiles would become smaller, the electronics would become better, our imaging capability would become better, our tracking would become better. At the end of the day, all of these defense-oriented reasons led to commercial applications that one had not thought about. Now, while we were doing it, you can now go back and look at the history of EU, all the countries in EU, Japan, Asia. Hardly any of these countries were investing as aggressively as we were in the ICT arena. And what this whole domain of ICT did was, I think, and this is my biased view, I'm not an economist, but I made this joke early today, and Thomas knows about it, but I'm going to say it again. I think when it comes to economic issues, the probability that an economist or a non-economist is right is just about equal. So I'm just going to go ahead and act like as if I'm an economist, right? So what we basically did was created what I think of as a wave of economic expansion. And this wave of economic expansion, this wave of wealth generation, which I think started in this country, and I'm not just being purely patriotic about this, I really believe that, started in this country, traveled through EU, partly because of the Marshall Plan, partly because of it had to go that way, into India and Asia. And we have seen literally the amount of wealth that has been created in the last 20 years has not been seen by this world ever in the history of this world between, I don't know, some few thousand years BC to now, right? And this is an amazing phenomenon. Now, one can argue if it is just ICT oriented. So I'm not going to claim it is only ICT oriented, but I will claim it is highly ICT enabled, right? So that's one point to remember. The second point to remember is the strategy of this country in investing in research and development and building a portfolio of technologies, ICT being one of them, which led to this great economic wave of expansion that has traveled the world. So why do I say this? I say this because if I look at, okay, it's not on this chart, if I look at what the world is investing right now, the US is still investing 2 times more than EU together in ICT research. And I can tell you this is not a good thing. Because now if you look at the world in a more global perspective, so let's just take China for example. For China to maintain status quo as of today, it has to maintain a growth rate of about 6%. But the whole idea of economic expansion is not maintaining status quo. It is bringing people out of poverty and making other people's lives better, right? So that means China has to maintain a growth rate which is higher than 6%. India has to be at 8%, and China has to be more like 10%. This is to bring Africa, where this wave of economic expansion has not touched us yet, has to start with a reasonably high growth rate. The US, I don't believe, has the ability to maintain that growth rate. It doesn't have the investment capability to kind of create that another wave of economic expansion that's going to go impact these countries. And so my point I'm making out here, since many of you are representing other countries right now, when you go back, you got to focus.